Welcome, everyone, to the Weinberg Group webinar entitled Overcoming Regulatory, Clinical, and Quality Challenges in Developing Combination Products. All participant lines will be in listen-only mode throughout the call. However, if you'd like to submit a question or comment to the presenters, click the button marked Ask a Question on your event window and submit your question. All questions will be answered via email within a week of the presentation. To start, I'd like to turn the conference over to Mr. Antos. Mr. Antos, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining our webinar. I'm Jeff Antos from the Weinberg Group, and I'll be moderating today's session entitled Overcoming Regulatory, Clinical, and Quality Challenges in Developing Combination Products. The Weinberg Group is a regulatory and scientific consulting firm serving pharma, biotech, and device clients. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C. I know you're really going to enjoy our speaker, Michael Swit, Weinberg Group Vice President. Michael is an attorney and a frequent keynote speaker at pharma and device industry events who has been addressing critical FDA issues since 1984. His vast experience prior to joining the Weinberg Group includes roles as Vice President, General Counsel, and Secretary of PAR Pharmaceuticals, CEO of FDA News, a premier publisher of FDA regulatory newsletters, and a successful track record as an FDA attorney for several prominent law firms. I'll now turn the presentation over to Michael.
Thank you, Jeff, and good morning and good afternoon to all of you, and good evening to those of you overseas. Thank you for joining us and taking the time out of your day. Today, we will be covering, as you know, the challenges of combination products. And over the next 45 minutes or so, I am going to go over first a brief history of combination product regulation, how it evolves. Then I'm going to focus on the primary mode of action, or the PMOA, which, as many of you know, is the key linchpin to how FDA regulates combination products. We'll then go on to the request for designation process, or RFD, for when you're not sure about your PMOA. Talk about how GMPs apply to combination products where you have two different types of regimes involved, typically drugs, the drug GMPs and the device quality system, but also other considerations such as the blood products and human cellular and tissue products. On to post-market safety reporting. And for both the GMPs and the post-market safety reporting, there are proposed rules that are pending at FDA. How many applications do you have to file? Or how many do you want to file? And finally, a little bit on user fees and how they apply to the process. So what is a combination product? A combination product is, put simply, when you have two different FDA-regulated components, a drug device, biologic device, a drug/biologic, or a drug/device and biologic. You could actually have more than one component. You could have more than two. You could even have three components in a combination product. But note, however, that if that doesn't include things such as food, dietary supplements, or cosmetics. So we have them when they're combined or mixed and produced as a single entity. We could have them as separate products that are packaged together in a single package. We can have them where they're packaged separately, but according to their investigational plan or proposed labeling, the intended use is only with another approved specified drug or device or biologic. And finally, and slightly different from the above, the last bullet point is very similar to the previous bullet point, and that's discussed when you have investigational drugs that are intended to be, or devices that are intended to be packaged separately, but will be used with another individually specified drug, device, or biologic, where both are required to achieve their intended use, their indication, or effect. So, moving on, and bear with me for a second, but this is not cooperating with me. The next slide should be Combination Galaxy. Jeff, can you advance the slides? Because for some reason or other, I am not able to. Now it works, sorry. So this is a slide I stole from FDA, but it gives you a brief overview from galactic perspective, I guess, of how there are differences. I mean, for instance, we all know, or most of us know, that in the biologics world, you have a BLA, or biologics licensing application. And to seek marketing, you have an IND to do the investigational work. You have current GMPs that are actually the drug GMPs, and you have an adverse event reporting system, which is specific to biologics. In the drug world, we don't do a BLA, we do a new drug application. And in conjunction with that, in the investigational stage, you have the IND. Again, you have GMPs, good manufacturing practices for drugs, and you have an adverse event reporting system that is unique to the drug world. However, as many of you know, in the device world, things are handled quite differently. You have a pre-market approval application for your Class 3 devices. You have, for most Class 2s, you have a 510K clearance process. To do investigational work on many devices, but not all, you have to submit an IDE when the device is a significant risk. But in the quality arena, the devices are governed by the quality system regulation. And while there are similarities, as I'll discuss later, between the two different GMP systems, there are some very distinct differences. And instead of the adverse event reporting system that you have for drugs and biologics, you have the medical device reporting rule in Part 803. So all of these present unique challenges where there are overlap between requirements, but there are some very, very distinct differences. Moving on. And I apologize, I don't know what's with my system today, but I usually don't have a problem advancing these slides. A brief history of combinations. So the first real true regulation of the combination product arena occurred in 1990 with the passage of the Safe Medical Device Act. And that required the assignment of a combination product to the lead center based on primary mode of action. However, it didn't define primary mode of action. And at that time, it was implemented, the regulation of combinations was implemented by a chief mediator and the ombudsman at FDA. Moving on, 12 years later, to the Medical Device User Fee and Modernization Act, a great acronym of MDUFMA. In 2002, established for the first time the Office of Combination Products, or OCP. And OCP was given broad oversight responsibilities to cover the life cycle of combination products, with a primary focus on coordinating reviews among FDA centers and ensuring consistency among similar reviews, and also to address the question of what happens when you're not sure what should be the lead center. And under Section 503G of the Act, which states the Safe Medical Device Act, the FDA is required, as I said, to assign a combination product to the primary mode of action. But because PMAOA was not defined in the statutory regulations, this left some great ambiguity. And even for some products, identifying the primary mode of action can be difficult. For instance, early in the development stage, you may just simply not know. Or what happens when products have two or more completely different modes of action, but neither one of them is subordinate to the other. And we actually had a client that ran into this problem. Fortunately, before they retained us, they had actually submitted a request for designation to FDA, and they had a unique combination of a drug product with a device where the device was actually an injectable, which was inert in the body. And they did not do, unfortunately, a persuasive job of telling FDA what they thought the primary mode of action is. So they ended up with a decision that I don't think they were particularly happy with. So we're going to be talking later on as to how you can try to avoid that result. So as I said, the primary mode of action was not defined in the statute, but it determines which is the lead center. To address this, FDA promulgated regulations in August of 2005, and you have a link there. And for those of you that know that FDA changed its website around a few years ago, and I actually first gave the heart of this presentation back in 2007, all the URLs in this presentation have been double-checked and should work. So the primary mode of action by regulation means first you have to look at what mode of action is. And the mode of action is the means by which a product achieves its intended therapeutic effect or action. And there are three types of mode of action for combination products: a biological product mode of action, a device mode of action, and a drug. And as I said, combination products typically have more than one. We'll have two modes of action. Now, by definition, sorry, this is, again, not cooperating with me. Should be on the slide that Mark says PMOA at the top. Jeff, can you back us up to the one that says PMOA, slide 9, please? Thank you. And Jeff, if you don't mind, I will ask you to turn the slides because I apologize, my computer is not being very cooperative.
No problem. I'll wait for your cue.
Thank you. The primary mode of action is the single mode of action of a combination product that provides the most important therapeutic benefit action of the combination product. So with more precision, and we should be on slide 9, it is that mode of action that is expected to make the greatest contribution to the overall intended therapeutic effects of the combination product. And you have a cite to the actual regulation. Next slide, please. The next slide talks about the constituent parts, or I will usually refer to them as components. When FDA and the combination world talks about components or constituent parts, they kind of tend to use those terms interchangeably. That refers to whether it's a drug, a device, or biologic. And as you can see, and I'm not going to go into these definitions in great detail in the interest of time, there are definitely some different modes of action. The most distinct one I will go over is the device mode of action. And that's where, and there are some similarities between these definitions. So if you know the biologics definition, the device definition, the drug definition, as they appear as definitions in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, appreciate some of these distinctions. But the device one is where the primary intended purposes is not done through chemical action within or on the body and is not dependent on being metabolized for the achievement of its primary intended purposes. And that's important because there are, as I said in the example I gave before of an injectable product that was relatively inert, was a product that looks like a drug. It comes in a syringe, is of liquid nature, but actually has a device mode of action. So it's very important to appreciate those distinctions. Next slide, please. Now, what are some of the factors impacting an analysis of primary mode of action? Well, there are a number of them, and the list here actually is derived from FDA's guidance on how you do a request for designation, which I'll get to in a minute or two. But we need to look at the proposed uses or indications, how it achieves its overall intended therapeutic effects, the relative contribution of each component toward the overall intended therapeutic effect, the duration of the contribution of each component toward the intended therapeutic effect. And that one, for example, is one where, using the example that I gave before, in their case, the drug component was thought to have a longer duration, while the device component was thought to be more short-acting. So one could argue, on a duration basis, that the longer acting was the more primary mode of action. But even in that analysis, you have to look at what is it treating, what is the indication. So these things are a complex balancing act to understand primary mode of action. You also have to understand the data or information that describes and supports your mode of action. So what happens if you can't determine, next slide please, the most important therapeutic action with reasonable certainty? Well, then FDA uses what it calls the assignment algorithm, which can be found at 21 CFR 3.4b. And that calls for them to look at two major factors. And these are considered in order. First is consistency. Is there an agency component that regulates other combination products that have presented similar questions of safety and effectiveness with regard to this combination product as a whole? And if they come to that conclusion, then they will tend to assign that to whichever center fits that criterion. But if that doesn't apply, they don't, for instance, it's really just a unique combination that's never been presented before, we look to safety and effectiveness. So which agency component, which center, has the most expertise related to the most significant safety and effectiveness questions presented by the combination product? So again, I'm giving back to our unknown client. In their case, the drug component was seen by FDA as presenting the most questions of safety and effectiveness relative to what they plan to use the product for. So they assigned the combination product, to the Center for Drugs. So, now, what happens if you can't really fit them in very well there? Well, the assignment algorithm then says you should go in and consider additional factors, intended use, and all of these are going to be balancing acts. The overall therapeutic effects. Does the device component incorporate a novel or complex design, or have potential for significant failure modes? So, for instance, on that one, clearly if they think the device might have significant failure modes, but it's being combined with a fairly well-known drug, they might tend to give that to the device center. In contrast, if the drug component contained a new molecular entity or a formulation, they might tend to give it to the Center for Drugs. Has a generic version of the drug been approved? Clearly, when we get down to the stage of generic drugs, that tells us that the product's been marketed for a fairly long time. In contrast, for a biologic, is that component, the biological component, a particularly fragile molecule, which they would want to make sure that the center, the proper reviewing divisions will be handling. Now, keep in mind that for those of you that know how biologics are regulated, that can still be the Center for Drugs if it's a therapeutic biologic, following the transfer in 2002 of most of the therapeutic biologic products to being reviewed by the Center for Drugs. But in contrast, for instance, if it was gene therapy that was being used in the combination product, that would end up in CBER or the Center for Biologics. Some additional factors for the assignment algorithm. How well understood are the components on a comparable basis? Is one more risky? Which component raises the greater risks? Have any components been approved or cleared? And then this may not always be the case. Is there a new indication, route of administration, or significant change in the dose or use of one of the components? All of these things are factors that they will consider in going through the assignment algorithm, particularly the second factor on safety and effectiveness. So after all that, you're working on your combination product and you're still not sure what its primary mode of action is. You want to make sure that you're in the correct center. You may want to be in a particular center that you view as more advantageous. Now, historically, a lot of people felt that was the devices center. Of course, for those of you who are active in devices, you know that the last 2 years has presented great challenges for the device regulatory process. And I've actually suggested to some clients it may be more beneficial in some ways to be in the Center for Drugs, particularly if you're looking at a 510K with all of the unknowns there. Of course, you have to weigh the challenges of what's going to be expected by each center. But when we get down to you're not sure of the primary mode of action, you can submit a request for designation. Now, this is a voluntary formal process under 21 CFR Part 3. Seeks to determine what's the regulatory identity or classification of the combination product as a whole, and to assign the lead center. A collateral issue that you can try to address is the clarification of regulatory pathway, although this typically is not something that is gone to in detail in the RFD process. Now, if you don't seek a request for designation and you submit your application for marketing and you just roll the dice as to which center you should be in, which application you use, FDA may look at your product and say, hey, you may be in the wrong place, and we're going to have to review the clock while we ourselves make a designation determination. And they might flip you over to a different center, which could also mean that you may have filed the wrong application. So I think clearly everyone understands that it's very important to get clarity on this before you file. And in fact, you can't even file a request for designation if you've already filed an application for an investigational exemption, for instance, for an IDE or IND for your product, or a marketing authorization, regardless of what type of application it is. FDA clearly says you should have enough information for them to make a decision. It's kind of self-evident. It's actually in the guidance. And you can meet with the Office of Combination Products before filing your request for designation, although it's not required. So you can seek that if you wish. So how is the RFD process governed? The regulations are found in 21 CFR 3.7. And FDA last month, just in time for this webinar, and we didn't plan it that way, but we were fortunate, they issued a guidance on how to write a request for designation. It appeared in the Federal Register, the notice, and you can see a link to that. And I will discuss the guidance, what the guidance requires in some detail, although I strongly encourage you, if you're considering a combination product, review the guidance in detail. In addition to having a great overview of how you do a request for designation, it also contains some really good information just in sort of a concise form on the regulation of combination products in general. So in the format for doing a designation, actually the guidance refers you back to the regulation. You can do it electronically. It's allowed but not required. There's a 15-page limit, however, for your designation, which includes attachments. So what goes into it? Next slide. There are 13 sections to your request for designation. And I think you can see there, I'm not going to read through all of them in detail, but they're fairly straightforward. Some of them, if you go through the guidance, it drills down into each one of these in more detail. The most important one, of course, there are two that are most important, and they are on the right-hand column, but the top bullet and the bottom bullet. So your modes of action, and you have to include all the modes of action, both whether it be device, biologic, device, drug, drug, biologic, and what you believe is the primary mode of action. And then at the bottom bullet point is you include your recommendation on what the primary mode of action is and what the classification of the product should be, and your center that you think should have primary jurisdiction, which should be the lead center. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the guidance drills down on all of the 13 sections. And in the interest of time here, I'm not going to go through that in detail. However, I do want to stress a few key points from the guidance. Of course, it's really important to state how your product should be assigned and why. And that, will come back to our linchpin of regulation of combination products, which is the primary mode of action. You need to really state with clarity and with support why your selected primary mode of action is the most important therapeutic action for the product. And you should use the assignment algorithm, and the guidance says this. You can't determine with reasonable certainty what that primary mode of action is. Use the assignment algorithm that I discussed on slides 12 to 14. And the guidance actually suggests, even if you're pretty sure about your primary mode of action, you may want to go through the assignment algorithm anyway. So that would be a subsidiary argument to say, we believe that the primary mode of action is clear, but even considering if we assume that it is unclear, going through the factors that are discussed in the assignment algorithm, we still can come out with the same conclusion. Now, and again, also, it's appropriate to file a request for designation, even if you believe the product is not even a combination product, but some uncertainty remains. So I have not really encountered that situation occur very often, but it is a possibility. So now, what does the Office of Combination Products do in the next slide in handling the request for designation process? Well, first of all, they review as with many FDA submissions, the process is, well, first we take a look at whether the thing's complete and we're going to allow it to come in at all. They review that within 5 working days for completeness. If it is complete, they will send you an acknowledgement letter, and they will send a copy of the request for designation to the 3 center liaisons, and that will be those that are impacted. Now, the center then comes back and makes recommendations to the Office of Combination Products within 21 days. There's then a consultation among the Office of Combination Products, the centers, and as often happens with many things at FDA, the Office of Chief Counsel. The decision is reached, response letters prepared, and any necessary clearances for the final decision are obtained, and they're required to issue a decision within 60 calendar days. And actually, technically, under the regulations, if they don't meet that timeline, your recommendation wins. All the more reason to file for the process. Now, if you don't like what they say, on the next slide, you can request reconsideration. Now, this has to be submitted within 15 calendar days. Now, your request for reconsideration can't exceed 5 pages. You're also not allowed to submit any new information. In fact, if you do, the agency will consider your request for reconsideration actually a request for a new designation. FDA then has 15 calendar days to respond, and FDA has been known to change a decision upon reconsideration. Now, what's the effect of the designation? The key thing that is, and hopefully you get the result that you want, is that the designated FDA center can not only be changed without your consent to protect the public health or some other compelling reason. So you have clarity and as much certainty as ever occurs with anything at FDA as to which is going to be the lead center. It's not going to be yanked on you later on, which clearly in all of what we do, while it's not always possible to give a totally precise answer as to what FDA will do, one of your jobs as regulatory professionals is to seek clarity, and this allows you to seek as much clarity as possible. Next slide. So here's a couple of the links for and all of jurisdictional decisions. These are decisions on primary mode of action. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can follow the links and read them. But just to highlight a couple of them. In the breath test combination jurisdictional decision, in that particular situation, you have a drug basically sort of being used as a reagent in combination with a device. And if you read the decision, you'll see that FDA concluded that the device really did most of the work. While the drug was important, they viewed that the device was the primary mode of the action. So that was assigned to the Center for Devices. Now, in the heparin catheter lock flush solutions, this was a little bit more interesting because with these, the device was designed to create some space so that fluid would not back out of the body into the catheter. To that was added an anticoagulant. So what FDA again concluded in this particular case is that the primary way that this worked was to prevent the backup, which they regarded as a physical activity, not a chemical activity, and being, again, device-oriented. So, and there are actually, literally, there are scores of these decisions that are accessible on FDA's website, and I encourage you that if you're going to work in this arena and you want to give examples of how FDA made some of these decisions, that you should go look at those. So, moving on to the next slide. As I said at the outset, one of the great challenges of our combination galaxy is which good manufacturing rules are going to apply. Do I have to, if I have a combination drug and device, do I have to meet all of the device quality systems and all of the drug GMPs? And that's two totally parallel systems. What do I do here? Well, initially FDA issued a guidance on this. And it set forth a broad framework for the application of GMPs to combination products. This was followed in September 2009 with a proposed rule for GMPs for combination products. And there's a link there to the actual Federal Register notice. And I encourage you to read, if you're working in this arena, any of these Federal Register notices, I encourage you to read them carefully because there's a lot of good information. Not only, well, first of all, you should know what the proposed rules say, but even more important is the preambles to these proposed rules. As you may know, when FDA issues a proposed rule or a final rule, they are required under the Administrative Procedures Act to discuss the reasons for their action. And under a somewhat convoluted interpretation of FDA, but accurate interpretation of FDA's administrative regulations, the preamble to a proposed or final rule constitutes an advisory opinion, which is actually binding on FDA until repudiated. So if you rely on the language of preamble, to the extent that it's not inconsistent with actually the precise language of a final rule, you are going to be in a protected situation relative to how you comply. So there's a lot of really good nuggets that you can glean from the preamble to any proposed rule. So an FDA, next slide, what they said in the GMP rules is that they found that there were certain assumptions they thought were valid. And that, first of all, they did say that you have an obligation once, both during and after the time that the two different components, whether it's drug, device, et cetera, were combined, that both sets of GMP rules technically apply, whether that was a single entity product or a co-packaged products. However, they realized that there was such overlap between the two sets of regulations, the drug GMPs and the device quality systems, that compliance could generally be achieved by using either regulation, and the agency did not see the need for totally parallel systems. Although if you read the proposed rule, they did allow you, if you wanted to have totally parallel systems. But what they proposed in the new rule, or the to-be-issued rule, because it's still pending, is what they called a streamlined approach, which basically is that you can do full compliance with one system plus compliance with designated parts of the other system. That is where the other system is not your usual system. And if you did that, and you complied with fully what you normally do plus the designated parts of the other system, you would be in full compliance with all of the second system. So to give you more specific examples, here on the next slide is what they said would, if you had a drug, what I call dominant system. That's not a phrase they use in either the preamble, but to stress it. You're functioning, you're a drug company, and all of a sudden you have a combination product. You know the drug GMP really well. In order to have that combination product without having to do a totally new parallel system, you would have to add into your overall quality system these 6 device quality system rules. Management responsibility, design controls, etc. The most significant ones of which are probably management responsibility, design controls, and corrective action, preventive action, or CAPA, because those are technically ones that are somewhat unique to the device system, although installation and servicing are as well. But CAPA is a concept, for instance, that I know most drug firms may not be as familiar with, although, as for those of you that are in the drug industry, you know that FDA has been announcing for some years, and is gradually moving over towards a more quality device-like GMP system, but it hasn't occurred yet. So if you're drug dominant, you have to follow those device quality systems rules. Now, if you're device dominant, you're used to dealing with gadgets. But you have a combination involving a drug or biologic, keeping in mind that the biologic GMPs are the drug GMPs, is you have to have these 7 drug GMP rules be followed. So, and they've ranged from tamper-evident packaging for OTC products, expiration dating, stability testing, etc. So, and if you do that, then you will be fully compliant for both the drug/biologics and the device side of the aisle. Now there are, on the next slide, some special cases. For instance, blood and blood component products. Well, not only are they typically they're a biologic that would be regulated under the GMP rules, under the drug GMP rules, but there are also specifically some requirements for blood and blood products that I won't go into in detail that you can be found in 21 CFR Part 606. And human cellular and tissue-based products have to follow the current good tissue practices. And many tissue products, cellular products, are also drug devices or biologics. Any cellular therapy would have to be consistent with the good tissue practices, but also would have to comply with the combined streamlined approach would be the recommendation. You can, as I said, you could have totally parallel systems, but that probably is not in your best interest, and FDA doesn't see it as desirable. But while there are some cellular and tissue products that are not even drugs or devices or biologics at all, there is a specific part of the Public Health Service Act which says that when a human cellular or tissue product is combined with another article, other than water and certain other agents, it is considered a drug, device, or biologic. So you'd have to look at 21 CFR 1271, and particularly the good tissue practice rules that are in 1271.145. So that resolves to some extent, assuming it becomes the final rule. And as I said, you can rely on that preamble for the time being as being having the impact of a guideline or advisory opinion, which is binding on FDA. How does the FDA plan to deal with post-market safety reporting? Because as many of you know, there are some fairly distinct rules, as I alluded to briefly at the start of our presentation. So initially, FDA had a concept paper, which you can still read and has some interesting information in it. But shortly after issuing the GMP proposed rule in the fall of 2009, FDA published a proposed rule on post-marketing safety reporting for combination products, which can be found in the Federal Register site that I gave you there. And their basic approach there was they said, basically, we're going to assume that you're going to follow a reporting system that's applicable to the type of marketing application under which your product is cleared, if it's a single application. So whether that be an NDA, a new drug application, or PMA, or a 510K on the device side, or a BLA. So basically they're saying, if for instance, if your primary mode of action was decided to be a device, that you would, and you were cleared under a 510K, you would satisfy the medical device reporting rule, Part 803, and any other required notifications. Because they assume the systems are substantially similar. But in going through that, they did identify 5 types of safety reports that are unique. And in that situation, you have to see, even if you're cleared under an NDA, you have to see in your scenario as an adverse event occurs, whether you may have to pull in and satisfy one of these 5 unique types of safety reports. And those 5 unique safety reports, next slide, are the 5-day report under the medical device reporting rule. This is when you learn of a reportable event associated with a device that requires remedial action, quote, to prevent an unreasonable risk of substantial harm to the public health. Has to be reported in 5 days. A 30-day device malfunction report. This is where, under the medical device reporting rule, the MDR, you get information that reasonably suggests that the device has malfunction. And if that malfunction were to recur, that the device or a similar device you market would be likely to cause or contribute to death or serious injury. Those are 2 of the unique safety reports from the drug side. From the device side, excuse me. For the drug and biologics world, one unique safety report is the 15-day alert. And this is where you have reports of a serious and unexpected adverse event. And most of you know that something is unexpected when it's not found in the labeling of the product. And the reason why this can be important is because if you look at the 30-day device malfunction report and you have a combination product, serious events are reportable in 30 days under the MDR. But the MDR rules don't talk about an unexpected event. So technically, if you have a combination, which is a device and a drug or a device and a biologic, and you have an unexpected serious event, you can't rely on the 30-day device malfunction report. You have to go with the more rigorous approach of the 15-day alert. The 2 other unique safety reports are the 3-day field alert. Now, a lot of people actually forget about this. I call it the tattletale clause because it actually requires you, if you've had an NDA approved or an ANDA, that if certain types of problems occur with your drug, such as bacteriological contamination or any failure to meet your specifications, for instance, if you fall out of stability at a regular stability testing interval, or labeling errors, particularly those that could lead to product mix-ups, you actually have 3 days to tell your local field FDA regional office, district office, of the situation. And I can guarantee you that typically what's going to happen is the first question they're going to ask you is, do you plan to recall the product? That's why I call it the tattletale provision, because you typically end up having to tell on yourself and having to do a recall whether you were originally planning to or not, because they're going to ask you that question. And finally, in the blood area, the expedited blood fatality report. Now, if the blood collection or transfusion we get a report of a fatality, you have to be reported within 7 days of learning of the fatality. So, in the next slide, how does this proposed safety rule work in action? And I want to stress again that this applies to post-marketing. This does not apply to what your requirements are in the investigational stage. In the investigational stage, the proposed rule was fairly silent on how those handled, so I would advise you that you should be very careful to try to satisfy all of the applicable ones. So if you're under an IND, and perhaps you need to make sure that you're going to satisfy whatever the IND rules are on the reporting of that event. So if a single application covers the combination, you have the application. You use the reporting rules that are required under your application. And then you have to analyze the scenario to see if it fits in one of our 5 unique types and see if you need to report it under one of those. Now, where it gets a little more complicated is when you have 2 applications that cover the combination. Now, if you can reasonably conclude which component, that is the device or the drug or the device or the biologic, caused the adverse event, you can use that component's reporting system. You don't have to satisfy the other component's reporting system. However, if it's unclear which component caused the adverse event, you have to satisfy the reporting requirement for all types of applications. And as we'll see in a second, there are a couple situations where you might want to have 2 applications, and you might have both a PMA and an NDA covering your combination product. So if it's unclear which component caused the adverse event, you're going to have to satisfy all the reporting. In addition, and there are going to be circumstances where an application covering your combination product is held by a third party. Maybe you have a right of reference to their application. You have a co-marketing agreement. You have to notify that person within 5 days of learning of the event and also satisfy your own reporting duties. They, in turn, have a duty to investigate the situation and report it consistent with their own requirements. So you need to keep in mind, the proposed rule is not real clear as to what constitutes learning of an event. So I would suggest to you that you err on the side of caution, and as soon as you have any information on the event, that you notify the other party. You can always supplement with more information as you go forward. So, next slide. How many applications do you have to file? Well, generally speaking, usually you only need to do one. And usually you only want to do one. FDA has issued a concept paper on the marketing applications for combination products, which you can access at the link I've provided. And in there, they basically say that the single application is sufficient. But the primary mode of action does not necessarily ensure the application status. The lead center is going to decide what that's going to require. So you may still have to argue with them, for instance, if you have a device as a primary mode of action, you may still have an argument with them as to how it's classified from a standpoint of whether it requires a PMA or a 510K. Or in the drug center, whether you're filing you still have to go through an analysis of whether you have to file a 505B1 or B2 or ANDA for that drug that's subject to your product. So some of the exceptions where a single application is not going to be sufficient is where one component is already approved, but the labeling will need to be changed. So that will require, and you're filing, for instance, a new drug application on the drug component, but you're going to require a change in the device, and that had been previously cleared under a 510K, then you may need to have some changes to the 510K. In biologics, for instance, legally you can have separate applications for the components. And when the components are separate and complex, you may be facing a situation where they're going to want you to have 2 different applications. For instance, a device in combination with a new molecular entity, clearly FDA is going to be very careful with any new molecular entity, whether it be drug or biologic in nature. or were needed to apply mechanisms, I love these types of quotes, mechanisms to ensure appropriate regulation or unique regulatory requirements not available under one application. The example FDA gives is of gene therapy. Now, how many applications? Next slide. You actually might want more than one, because to qualify, for instance, for Waxman-Hatch exclusivity, you have to file an NDA. So if you have, for instance, a drug-eluting stent, where we all know, many of you know that a drug-eluting stent, the primary mode of action is considered to be the stent. But let's say you have a new drug you're going to use to prevent restenosis of the opened-up artery. That new drug, if it's a new molecular entity, you're going to want to have to maximize your protection under the Waxman-Hatch exclusivity clause. But if you don't submit an NDA, if you solely go under a PMA for that, you won't be entitled to it, because you only get exclusivity for drugs that are approved under Section 505B, the new drug provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Similarly, orphan drug status. Or sometimes just to protect proprietary data if two firms are involved. There's a complex decision tree that's suggested in a concept paper on how these are handled, which I'm not going to go into detail here in the interest of time. Next slide. Now, I wish I could tell you that you're going to dodge all the user fees, but the guidance on user fees for combination products is basically it's going to depend on the type and number of applications. But if two applications are required, you still pay 2 fees. And if you submit 2 applications voluntarily, for instance, to get that Waxman-Hatch exclusivity, well, there's going to be an upfront cost for that exclusivity. And as you know, these user fees are not getting any cheaper. But for that extra market protection of the exclusivity, particularly if you have fragile patents on your products that can be challenged easily by those aggressive generic drug firms that are out there, having that extra exclusivity under Waxman-Hatch can be well worth the $1.5 million or so that you have to pay for the user fee. But also, to keep in mind, there's an innovative product waiver that you could also consider seeking. And that concludes my overview of some of the key challenges of regulatory, clinical, and quality in the combination product world. I provided you on the last 2 slides with some references to some other key sources of information on combination products, which I invite you to look at. In particular, the final rule on primary mode of action, I would recommend to anyone who's filing a request for designation. While there is a good discussion of primary mode of action in the new guidance document issued last month, as I said, and as many of you know, a guidance document is not binding on FDA. But the preamble to the primary mode of action final rule is binding on FDA. So read it with care. And those are some other examples of references that you can find out more on combination products from FDA sources. I thank you all for your attention. I hope you have benefited from today. And I'm going to turn the microphone back over to my colleague, Jeff, for our Q&A session.
Thanks, Michael. I've got a number of questions here. We have a little bit of time, so I'll just fire them out to you. The first one is, can I meet with the Office of Combination Products after I submit my RFD?
Well, as I think I alluded to this in the webinar, body of the webinar, no, you can't. And the reason for that, actually, is once you file the RFD, they're under a strict timeline. They've got 60 calendar days to answer your RFD. So they will not meet with you after you file the RFD. And I don't think it makes a lot. And it clearly makes more sense if you think that you need a meeting, that you can request a meeting, and that's discussed in the guidance document as to how you can seek such a meeting.
Okay. Thank you. Question here on electronic filing. Hey, you said we could file the RFD electronically. What format is required?
There is not a specific format that's required. What FDA says is that you should use a common electronic format, such as a PDF. However, keep in mind you still need to file 2 paper copies with the Office of Combination Products if you file electronically. I would encourage you to do both, because certainly having an electronic copy can help facilitate the way they move things around at FDA. Okay, thank you. A pre-meeting question here. Can I seek
pre-IND or pre-IDE meetings with FDA on a combination product?
Oh, certainly, and I highly recommend it for those of you who believe in as we do, in the importance of clarity in the regulatory process. As I mentioned in the body of the webinar, there's not a good opportunity to discuss the regulatory pathway when you do a request for designation. It's not really supposed to be the focus of the request for designation. But once, if you're real sure about your primary mode of action, you skip the RFD's process altogether, then clearly it would be an appropriate time to seek a pre-IND meeting if you're going to be in the Center for Drugs, or a pre-IDE meeting if you're going to be in the Center for Devices. Or similarly, if you happen to have one of the more exotic approaches such as gene therapy or cellular therapy that requires you to be in the Center for Biologics, seek a pre-IND meeting at the Biologics Center. It can really help you focus on what the true regulatory requirements are, because the combination product process is essentially focused on primary mode of action. Although obviously we've explored today some very important collateral issues relative to how do you satisfy good manufacturing practices and how you're going to deal with post-market safety reports.
Okay, thanks. Another interesting one, does the OCP actually get involved in the management of the review or just the assignment process?
My understanding is that OCP does not manage the review per se. If there are issues that arise during the course of the review that are particularly related to combination policy, they will become involved. However, typically, once it's been assigned to a lead center, that lead center will take will take the lead and will govern how the process works. Now, typically, there's going to be, depending on what the nature of the component that's not the lead, if, for instance, it's in the drug center and a device, it's a device as well, then there will be a consult, and the nature of that consult will depend significantly on what FDA already knows about the device in question. So sometimes we had a product I worked on years ago where it was a biologic in combination with a device, and device we never heard from the device center on it was all getting input from on our investigational plan from the Center for Biologics, and every once in a while the device center would say something, but not much.
Thanks. Here's another device center question that I think is interesting too. Would or I guess could a center decide that another center's type of application should be used? For example, CBER decides that a 505(b)(2) is appropriate, or would they only decide a type within their own center?
Well, that's a very interesting. Yeah. And candidly, I've never heard of that occurring.
Yeah.
It theoretically is possible. I don't see why it would occur, because it just wouldn't be logical for them to say that it doesn't really fit into our regulatory scheme. They know the devils they know. So they're going to be dealing with saying this. I think the bigger question of the device center is it going to require a PMA or is it going to require a 510K? And if you are going to go 510K, then the other questions are going to be what is the data they're going to require, particularly with the growing trend at FDA to ask clinical data in support of 510Ks. And for those of you that are not real familiar with that situation, this very frequently occurs when a device that's been proposed has new technological characteristics that are different from the device that is thought to be used as the predicate for the 510K, or there are new indications for use that are different from or intended uses from the predicate device. That's often scenarios where clinical data will be required by FDA as opposed to just performance or bench testing.
Okay, thanks. A lot of interesting questions remaining. Michael, I'm going to throw one more at you before we wrap up. Can I get exclusivity under Waxman-Hatch or Orphan Drug Act or under the new biosimilars law for combination products?
Well, I think I touched on that during the webinar, but one thing I didn't stress is that the extent of the exclusivity that you can get, well, first of all, it's dependent, as I said, in order to get it, you're going to have to file the type of application that's required to secure it. But also that will only apply to that particular component as opposed to the combination product as a whole. For instance, if you have a unique medical device that you develop, having Waxman-Hedge exclusivity is not going to protect someone from coming along and mimicking that device. Although, hopefully you have really good patent lawyers that have given you patent protection. So it only applies to the extent the combination product is a drug or biologic.
Good. Okay, great. Thank you. We got a lot of great questions, a lot of participation here, and we're going to email the answers to the remaining questions to the participants within the next week, along with the presentation with all those great links that Michael put in there. I encourage you to take a moment to fill out the survey, so you should have a click to fill out a survey for us, which is extremely helpful. Michael, thanks for a great presentation, and also my thanks to the participants for joining in, posing questions, etc. Signing off.
Thank you. This concludes the presentation. Before you log off, we would very much appreciate if you could please take a moment to complete the short evaluation form. Thank you for your participation.